So the final location that we're going to discuss here that Intel considered was the country of Costa Rica. Now, Costa Rica is not necessarily the first country that would jump to mind as an interesting location for one of Intel's manufacturing plants. Most people, when they think of Costa Rica, tend to think of, beautiful rainforests, or perhaps if any kind of investment would be made there, maybe an investment in ecotourism sort of venture, that kind of thing. So, not necessarily, the place you think of to find the highly skilled workers and the other infrastructure Intel would need. It is a beautiful country. I love Costa Rica. I lived in Costa Rica for a time. It's great, especially if you love torrential rainfall, right, for 4 hours a day during the rainy season. That's your place, right? But so it is an interesting location. But from Intel's perspective, you might think, gee, why would you do that? Now, I think what's interesting to notice here is that it wasn't Intel's, first idea either as a possible location. It wasn't Intel that it wasn't TED, of course, that initially put Costa Rica on the short list of countries the site selection team should visit. It was the investment promotion agency in Costa Rica that proactively approached Intel and said, hey, we learned that you're possibly looking at some locations for a plant in Latin America. You should visit Costa Rica. So that's why Costa Rica was added to the itinerary for the site selection team. Now, when you think about it, here's a country smaller in physical area, smaller than the state of West Virginia, right? And with a population, now it's grown since the time the case was written, but it's even now just about 4 million or so. So it's a very small population. Not necessarily the kind of place you'd think to find massive numbers of skilled workers, as you might in the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil or the state of Jalisco in Mexico. So again, it's interesting that this was one of the locations they visited. But again, it was the investment promotion agency. I'm going to write the name of the agency here, CINDE. It's all spelled out in the case for you, but of course the acronym is CINDE. And this was the investment and promotion agency that was promoting Costa Rica as a location. And I think it's interesting if you kind of look through that case, you'll see the sort of the evolution or the story about CINDE. And essentially what this was, it was not a government agency. And I think that's significant, that CINDE was actually an agency that was a private organization. It wasn't constrained as government agencies might be by salary limitations or the kind of who they could hire, those kinds of things. So CINDE was able to attract some of the very highly qualified people. I mean, this was set up really by, it was supported in part by businesses in Costa Rica that were interested in attracting more foreign direct investment. And so, because of that, it had the ability, this kind of flexibility, to act more like a business itself. And the kind of personnel working at CINDE, this private investment and promotion agency, were, many of them had MBAs from U.S. universities. They had worked for big U.S. multinational corporations. They were former executives at those corporations. So they had an in-depth understanding of how U.S. companies operated. And also they themselves worked like that, right? So they were very proactive. As I mentioned, they're the ones that initiated contact with Intel about visiting Costa Rica. And before any company visited Costa Rica, the team at CINDE did all of the research they could on that company to learn everything that might come up, any kind of questions, anticipate those questions. So they were highly skilled at doing this. And so they knew very well that Intel had this concern, right, about the team was going to ask them and be concerned about stable, predictable, transparent rules of the game and not to offer any special deals. So I think what is interesting, I'm just going to go to the next slide when we talk about the positive and negative characteristics for Costa Rica, that I suppose, we have to put up over here on the top CINDE, and the fact that CINDE had done this research and knew everything they could about Intel, and also did a very good job of briefing the government officials that the Intel team would meet with. So as I mentioned, anytime a company goes to a country, they can't just plop down their investment there. They have to first work with the government, negotiate the terms of the investment. And so what Synde did very effectively is it collaborated with the government. It worked with the government. But because of its private status, it had flexibility to, maybe attract a different kind of personnel that could understand companies or interact with them more effectively than government officials might be able to do. And so I think this helped explain why Synde was so proactive, was so effective at anticipating Intel's concerns, and they did a great job of briefing government officials, hey, if they ask you about anything, make sure that you tell them that in Costa Rica, we're a democracy, a long-standing democracy, and we have very transparent, predictable rules, and don't offer them any special deals, right? Because that's something they will be very concerned about. So I think this explains a lot about Intel's reaction, right, or Intel's site selection team interaction with government officials. So, when they went to Costa Rica, the team immediately started to notice there were some issues, right? I mean, they noticed that there were some positive things. Costa Rica, because since at the 1940s, it did not have a military. They had disbanded the military and plowed more money into education. It did have a highly educated, population. Many of them spoke English, but at the same time, it wasn't necessarily the kind of education that Intel needed. They didn't have the vast numbers of skilled technicians, right? Costa Rica hadn't really emphasized manufacturing of this type to that extent. So I think they noticed some of these positives. At the same time, they noticed lots of shortcomings, at least in terms of their immediate needs. They noticed that there was an airport and good, relatively decent roads to the airport. At the same time, right, they noticed that the airport did not have enough flights in and out of the country. At the time, maybe they could get a flight a week. And so that wasn't going to be sufficient. So the Intel team noticed some of these kinds of issues. They did notice a major positive that in Costa Rica, there was a different sort of regulation on labor unions. Companies were not required to have a labor union, right? There was an alternative form of organization that they could establish called solidarity associations. It's explained in the case. But essentially, the main point is companies would not be required to have a labor union, which, of course, was a big positive for Intel. And another significant thing, the government was very interested in attracting this kind of foreign direct investment. And in fact, there were tax incentives encouraging foreign direct investment. As long as people would export what they were producing, you could invest in the free trade zones in Costa Rica and here's what the tax incentive said, as explained in the case: no taxes, no corporate taxes of any kind for 8 years. Right? No tax payments of any kind. What a significant tax incentive. And then if you reinvest it after those 8 years were over, wow, the next 4 years you get 50% reduction in taxes. So pretty significant tax incentives. And the deal was you had to export everything you produced, and that's what Intel planned to do anyway. So this was a major benefit. Now, what's interesting is, at the time that Intel was doing this, the president of Costa Rica, Jose Maria Figueres, as explained in the case, very dynamic, young president, was very interested in attracting foreign direct investment and specifically high-tech investment. And so I think that this was something interesting to Intel too. There seemed to be a government very interested and responsive, and Synde, of course, was very proactive and anticipating their questions. But they did see, as I mentioned, those negatives. So they said, look, there's inadequate numbers of skilled technicians. But keep in mind, the government officials had been thoroughly briefed by Synde. And so they knew not to say, oh, we can fix that with a special deal. So what they said, they had a very interesting way of talking to the site selection team about this. They said, well, we can turn that negative, the lack of skilled technicians, into a positive. In fact, you can help us, Intel. You can provide some instruction in our curriculum for our public government-run technical schools, and we'll simply increase the numbers of skilled technicians. Now, think what the Intel team was saying. They're saying, my gosh, this sounds like a special deal. We've made a point. We don't want any special deals. This is very important to us not to have that, any kind of special arrangements just for Intel. One government may offer that, and then it's not continued in the next government. So anticipating this, right, briefed by CINDE, which had researched this issue and knew how to respond to that concern, the government officials, when the site selection team raised that issue, right, we don't want a special deal just for Intel. They said, it's not a special deal for Intel. We expect, if you invest here, we expect many other high technology firms to follow you. You'll be like an anchor investment. Others will come once they see you've invested here. And so then this education, this highly skilled workforce we're creating will be used not just for you, it's for all the high-tech companies that will come, you see? So then it wasn't a special deal. They knew how to frame it in a way that made it a positive thing. Same thing with the transportation infrastructure, the flights. There weren't enough flights in and out of the country. And Intel said, this won't do. We need daily flights. You only have like one flight a week. So the government official in charge of transportation said, oh, no problem. What we're going to do, you see, is we're going to give more licenses to more airlines. We have an open skies policy we're going to implement. And that'll bring in so many different flights. There'll be flights all the time, in and out. And the Intel team, well, we don't do anything special for us. We don't want any special deals. And the government official, briefed by CINDE, responded, oh, don't worry, that's not for you. That's for our tourism industry. You see? It's not a special deal just for you. This is something we're doing to improve our overall business environment. So in every case, as the team, noticed concerns and the government officials proposed solutions, the government officials did it in a way that made clear that this wasn't going to be just a special deal for Intel. This was something that they were going to do anyway, or was, relevant to the country anyway. They were doing something, so it wasn't a special deal. And another issue, of course, that Intel noticed immediately, they said, gee, you don't have any discounts for heavy users of electrical power. Your costs of electrical power are relatively high here. Compared to Mexico, we could get much lower electrical power costs at that time in Mexico. And the government official there at that point said, oh, don't worry, we're going to implement a discount for heavy users of electrical power. And Intel said, well, don't do anything just for us. We don't want a special deal. And the government official said, it's not just for you. It's for all the big high-tech companies that will be coming, right? So again, they turned that negative into a positive. So I think this explains a lot. And I think CINDE's involvement, especially in its effective collaboration with the government, helped explain this approach that the government of Costa Rica took. Now, what I think is interesting, and this is a relatively obscure note, somewhere in that case you'll see this, but I think at this point the Intel site selection team got a little cocky, maybe a little bit arrogant, right? And they said, well, and maybe, in fact, maybe this was more of a test to see, how this place really operated in Costa Rica. So what they said, now this is, I think, significant, is they said at this point, they said, gee, this is all very interesting and very nice, and we love especially your tax incentives, right? No taxes for 8 years, and then a 50% reduction the next 4 years if we reinvest. But could you make that even more attractive? Hey, could you make that, no taxes for 8 years, and then let's say a 75% reduction the next 4 years if we reinvest? Could you make a change on that one, huh? And here's what I think is interesting and significant. The government official in charge of the the finance minister said, we're sorry. We will try, you see, but that's a significant change. That would be literally a change in our tax laws. That's a very major regulatory change here. We can't just snap our fingers on that one. We would have to present that one to the Legislative Assembly of Costa Rica. You see, that would literally take an act of Congress in Costa Rica to make a change like that. We will try, we will present it, but we cannot promise you that we can make that change, you see, because we're a nation of laws. And we do things in a very transparent, predictable way that goes through a process that we have here. So we will present it, but we cannot promise that that change will be implemented. Now, what I think is significant is that the Intel team, instead, they were offering for more tax incentives. They were getting the answer, we can't promise you this. They loved that answer. And I think the reason they loved that answer to such an extent, the reason they loved it, is because it showed that on this big thing, the tax incentives, right, a major issue, this was not something that a leader could just snap his fingers and change like that. This was something that literally would take an act of the Legislative Assembly of Costa Rica, and even if that happened, there would be a process, right? There would be a very transparent, predictable way of doing this, very much following prescribed rules and so on. So the Intel team loved this, because then they said, well, gee, you know what? This thing that means a lot to us isn't going to change overnight. It's something that, you know, there's real rules of the game here that are in place, and they are predictable and they are stable. And I've got to say that at this point, Ted did check, right? I must say the team did notice and observe that the major political parties of Costa Rica were in support of this tax break at the time, so there would likely not be any change. So I think this is, at the same time, think of the negatives, right? I mean, we're talking about a country, you know, that it's not the kind of place you would think of immediately, right? Nice volcanoes, right? Nice rainforests, but not necessarily the place you would think of as the first place to jump to mind for this kind of investment. So that then, you know, there's a lot of things for Intel to think about. All of these wonderful changes the government is promising to make, but again, they're saying we can make that. It's not like Mexico, the business environment in Mexico, especially the state of Jalisco, that was ready to go. They already had the high-skilled workers. They already had, the infrastructure in the airport with all the flights, and in Costa Rica they were relying on promises. So I think that's something. You know, this really is not clear that Costa Rica is a clear-cut choice.